first theme to be gathered from the book is to look under the hood. And what I mean by that is to apply scrutiny to what you're doing. And Merriam-Webster Dictionary defines scrutiny as a searching study, inquiry or inspection, an examination, and a searching look. And I think, one of the main things that I gathered from this book in terms of Ed's approach was to apply this scrutiny to everything that's important to him and what he's doing in his world. So not just his academic career, but even, throughout his childhood when he was doing experiments. He references reading encyclopedias and different journals and articles to learn how to do chemistry and physics experiments. Throughout his hedge fund days and obviously through blackjack and roulette, he's obviously applying a high level of scrutiny. If he took the general understanding of what something is, for example, you can't beat the casinos, blackjack has a house edge and it can't be beaten, then he wouldn't have been able to obviously achieve what he has achieved. And I think this is a pretty important one in our day and age with just how the world is at the moment. There's so much information. There's an avalanche of different tidbits, from Twitter to articles to longer research papers to books. Everything's widely available. There's so much to sift through, and it's very difficult as an initial step to sift out what is noise and work your way through that. And then obviously once you've done that, to go into detail or enough detail on what's important. And that's one of the things that Ed had a pretty single-minded focus on, was to apply that scrutiny, to look under the hood, as I'm going to call it, to the extent where there was a silly example earlier on where he was talking about he wanted to know why the body would react to heat on a stove, and he wanted to check for himself and put his finger on the hot stove and see what happens, and he obviously burnt himself, and then that was put in his back pocket, and he realized, okay, then that checks out. I'm not going to put my hand on the hot stove again. So, just from that all the way through to some of his hedging approaches throughout the time at Princeton Newport, it's pretty clear that he was not going to take what an expert said, what a pundit said, what the media said. Nothing was going to be taken at face value. And like I said, even to extremes like the stove example, to all the way through to blackjack and roulette, that they can't be beaten. They're closed games with an established edge over hundreds of years of French aristocrats to famous investors trying to beat these games and not being able to do it. People would always say, why do you think they build the casinos, and why do you think they look like this if people were able to beat blackjack or roulette? And I think that's something he took at face value rarely and investigated himself. And obviously through that, the scientific method comes up, where he wouldn't rely on what other people would say, and he would go through the different elements of the scientific method to observe, to measure, experiment different hypotheses and work through those, test those, and come up with his own outcome, which was pretty important given, certainly in the hedge fund world, a lot of the things he was doing was before published papers on these topics, which we'll get into a little bit later on. And I think it's even extends to when he talks about his plan for raising his children. This is a quote from the book. "We planned to give them all the education they wanted, teach them to think for themselves rather than simply accept received wisdom from experts and authority." And I'd love to ask Ed if they should rely on his wisdom. I'm guessing he might even say no. It obviously is something he values pretty highly, is applying that scrutiny to a lot of things. So, and I think the other thing to note is it certainly depends on context, and it can change and it can evolve. And I think that's one of the critical elements where he mentions, this is another quote, "I wasn't ready to accept these claims about blackjack. I decided to check for myself if the player could systematically win." And I think that's critical, where he took something that everyone said ad nauseum that cannot be beaten. It is what it is, unfortunately, and that's the way it goes. And he applied his own rigor to that and was able to find out that, yes, you can actually systematically win. And it's worth applying that scrutiny, because there are certainly things that change and evolve over time, and certainly something worth applying yourself to because of the payoffs that are possible within that. And just thinking more broadly about this topic and interpretation of how we can think about it, I think the other aspect is you need to be skilled enough to go and look under the hood and apply that scrutiny. I think it's something that you've got to focus on your area of competence, and Another quote that Ed talks about in his book is people tend to make the error of seeing patterns or explanations where there aren't any. And there's an article on thebusinessofbetting.com about this. It's the Texas Sharpshooter article where, spraying a bunch of bullets against a barn wall and then going and finding 2 or 3 or 4 bullets that are closely together, and then saying, well, look, I'm a good shot because there's 3 or 4 bullets that are together, and putting a circle around those. There's many examples of bias and cognitive dissonance in life, and certainly when it comes to betting and gambling, investing, and those types of things, you have to have the skill set to be able to look at the problems as they are and then decide, are you able to apply the scrutiny to the level that's required? And I don't think we can do it in all areas of life, but we can certainly do it in our given fields. And we'll talk about range a little bit later on and finding analogies from different areas, but I think that's a important interpretation of this, is having the skill set to be able to look under the hood. And I think the other quote from his card counting days that I noted down here was, what appears random for one state of knowledge may not be if we are given more information. And I think that's the main aspect of looking under the hood when talking about blackjack and counting cards. If someone walked into the casino for the first time and they were told about blackjack and, first review of blackjack themselves, they might say, well, yeah, it's random. We don't know what cards are coming. And, 21 beats 20 and 20 beats 19 and so on. And there's rules for what the dealer must do when they get to certain numbers and whatnot. But if you look at it in the context that Ed did before anyone else, in terms of, well, there's 52 cards in a deck, aces are worth a certain amount, 10s are worth a certain amount, just like 2s and 3s are worth certain amounts. If I can eliminate certain cards from that 52 and now there's 40 cards left and 3 aces have gone early, then I can assign certain probabilities and change the possibilities of determining house edge versus player edge in blackjack. And I think that's something else where Ed was able to think more broadly, certainly in blackjack anyway, in that context, and apply that scrutiny to ultimately find himself an edge when it came to card counting. And I think, Ed, he reaped the rewards and the benefits that came with that, applying that level of scrutiny and examining all the different aspects of areas that he was looking into to try and make money. And, one of those was the Black-Scholes method, which was published in, I think, the early 70s. Scholes and Merton won a Nobel Prize in the late 90s, and he was using this method, a couple of years before that formula was even published. And it just goes to show that in certain areas, if you're looking and applying that scrutiny and in your domain, you can certainly have advantages well before the market even knows about them. And even at that point, I think it would take time for the market to fully incorporate all of those. You talk about the 60s. I'm not sure it's as easy to get a research paper in the late 60s, early 70s as it is now with just the way publishing works and the internet and so on. So it was a pretty good real life example of what can happen when you do apply that knowledge and you can apply it to what you're doing in your domain. And I think it's just thinking about the real world. I myself think about how many times I hear about research, I read an article, and then I put myself in the position of that person who's done all the work or they've done all the research. And the reality is, if you apply this type of scrutiny that Ed does, you would want to go and look at the research, look at the articles, certainly when it's your area of expertise. Obviously, being legally trained and working in that field, if there is a source document and a contract, reading a half a page summary or going in and reading a 120-page contract is very different. And I think in life, often we'll, certainly in areas of non-expertise or areas when things are time sensitive, we might opt for the shorter version, the tweet version, the one-page version, the article version, and take that at face value, and that may not necessarily be the best approach. And obviously there's time constraints with everything, but I think that taking things at face value without enough scrutiny is where there could be cause for damage later on, and certainly something Ed was rarely doing and was obviously in his fields applying that level of scrutiny and depth to what he was looking into, because he knew how important it was. And I think that's something that's more difficult now with all the different access to information, how it's provided, and so on. And I think that's where those things become your inputs, and you need to make sure, whether it's cleaning the data, whether it's making sure those inputs are correct, because if they're biased, those inputs, or if they have some falsity or error, then the outputs are going to be that way as well. So it is not an easy thing to do, certainly not across all different fields or areas that you're looking into, but it's certainly something to think about when trying to be more in depth on how you look at things and think about things. And I don't think necessarily it's that simple for all of us to get to the level of Ed Thorp in how we do that, but certainly things we value, it's worth applying that scrutiny. And then I think on the flip side of that, when there is limited downside and it's not necessarily our domain or area of expertise, then there obviously is benefit to take things on face value, where there's a time and cost benefit. Limited downside, things like restaurant recommendations, there's limited downside, I would say, to taking someone's restaurant recommendations rather than reviewing their cleanliness rating and so on, or buying a car. If you're going to spend $15,000 on a used car, you probably don't want to go to mechanic school and figure out all the different components before you do that. You can probably rely on an expert, and I think that's where Ed in his field may seek counsel from experts, but then he would go further and deeper, and he would look at the source data, and he would look at the underlying components that went into a hedging position, for example, or whatever it might be. He went into every aspect of a roulette wheel, or cards when it came to blackjack, and how that was done, the rules of the game, and so on. So I think it obviously is a balance, but it's a pretty important topic to consider, and then think about the best way to use your time. So I think, just to wrap it up, I think it's a pretty key aspect of the book that comes through in almost every aspect, that type of scrutiny that Ed put on things that he valued was critical, and it allowed him to be the expert and to have all the information available that he had validated himself. And I think it shows very clearly throughout the book that whether it is, he some of his philanthropy towards the end of the book that he references, and just the rigor that goes into some of that, very different to how everyone else would do it. And I think that's where, this contrarian attitude might come out in certain aspects, but I don't think it was necessarily on purpose, or it wasn't a clear intent from the beginning, certainly not referenced that way in the book. It was when he went through the process of applying scrutiny, his outcome might have been very different to other people's outcome because of the way he thought about problems and solving them, and he was doing things that others hadn't necessarily considered or done before. So I think sometimes by accident or by design, maybe he was a contrarian, but he was correct, and in doing so, that's where he had very large edges and advantages, and obviously went about maximizing those.